For more than 70 years, the mystery of the Somerton Man has been one of the world's greatest unsolved cases. Then, in 2022, headlines everywhere scream that the case was finally solved. But was it? When you take a really close look at the forensic evidence, it seems this legendary case might not be closed at all.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to conduct our own little investigation, following the evidence just like the pros. We'll start with that big breakthrough claim, then we'll put the evidence itself under the microscope, look at the missing paper trail, and even check out the thousands of other guys who could have been him. Let's see if this case is really as open and shut as they say.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the story that made international news. This is the official version of how this 75-year-old puzzle was supposedly finally put to rest.
Yeah, identifying a man named Charles Carl Webb was hailed as this massive achievement. The lead researcher even called it a world record, a real triumph for modern science, cracking a case that had stumped everyone for decades.
So here's the quick and dirty timeline. It all starts in 1948, body on the beach. A year later, they make a plaster cast of his head and shoulders. Then, we fast forward all the way to 2022 when a single hair found trapped in that old plaster supposedly gives them the DNA match to Carl Webb. On the surface, it's the perfect ending to a long story. But this is where our investigation really kicks off. Because when you actually put the science under a microscope, the whole thing starts to look like it's built on a pretty shaky foundation. All right, let's zoom in on the star of the show, that one single strand of hair. It turns out, it all boils down to one tiny, microscopic detail, a detail that creates a massive problem for the whole story. So the key here is a feature called root banding. It's this dark little band that can show up near the root of a hair. And what's so important is that there are two different types, and they tell two completely different stories about when that hair fell out. You've got ante-mortem banding, which means before death, and that's a sign of life. It's caused by processes happening in a living body. Then you have post-mortem banding, after death, which is caused by decomposition. One is what you'd expect to find in a sample from someone who's passed away. The other is, well, impossible. This difference is everything. Now, the official claim was very clear. The photo of the hair was published with the caption saying it showed post-mortem banding. That would fit the story perfectly, right? A hair from the Somerton Man taken after he died. Case closed. Well, here's the bombshell. A critical analysis of that exact same photo shows the banding isn't near the root at all. It's further up. And that pattern is actually consistent with ante-mortem banding, the kind that can only form in a living person. This is what we mean by a temporal impossibility. The physical evidence itself seems to be screaming that it came from someone who was alive.
But you know what? Let's pretend for a second that we just ignore what we see under the microscope. There's another huge, glaring problem. Nobody has any idea where this hair actually came from. Its entire history is a blank.
See, in any real investigation, you have to have something called a chain of custody. Think of it like a tracking number for a package. It's a perfect, unbroken record of every single person who touched that piece of evidence, from the moment it was collected to the moment it was analyzed. Without that, you can't prove it's the real deal. And for the hair that supposedly solved this case, that paper trail is completely non-existent. There are no public records of who took it, when they took it, how it was stored for 70-plus years, or who handled it. From a scientific or legal standpoint, an undocumented sample is basically an unverifiable one. So this brings us to another huge layer of doubt. Even if we could somehow trust the hair, was Carl Webb the only person who fit the description? Oh, not by a long shot.
A deep demographic analysis started with this pretty big number. 16,213. That's the estimated number of guys born in the Australian state of Victoria in 1905, the same place and year as Carl Webb. This is our starting line.
So, using historical records, you can start narrowing it down. You take out the men who would have died naturally by 1948, those killed in the wars, and since Webb wasn't married, you take out all the married men. After you subtract all those groups, you're still left with a pretty shocking number. And that number is 9,764. That's how many men from that same group were alive, single, and essentially unaccounted for in 1948. Statistically speaking, that's almost 10,000 other potential Somerton men. I mean, focusing on just one man without ruling out any of the others is kind of like finding one piece of hay in a giant barn and declaring you found the needle without ever bothering to check the other thousands of haystacks right next to it.
So if the hair looks like it came from a living person, it doesn't have a paper trail, and the so-called suspect is just one of nearly 10,000 possibilities, it really makes you ask the question, where on earth did this mystery hair actually come from?
And this leads us to a fascinating alternative theory. Back in the 1940s, it was actually common practice for artists and taxidermists to mix fibers, like animal or even human hair, into plaster to make it stronger. And a close look at the bust shows that there's a separate finishing layer on the head, which is exactly where you might add something to create a realistic hair texture.
In fact, historical research shows that human hair swept up from salon floors was literally sold for this exact purpose. This gives us a totally plausible way that a random piece of cut hair from a living person, which would perfectly match the ante-mortem evidence, could have gotten mixed into the plaster back in 1949 with absolutely zero connection to the Somerton Man himself.
So, when you start putting all these pieces together, the contradictory evidence, the missing paperwork, the flawed statistics, and a really plausible alternative explanation, the celebrated solution starts to look less like a closed case and more like a series of major scientific blunders.
Let's just recap the biggest problems here. The physical evidence itself points to a living person. The sample's origin is a total mystery. The results have never been confirmed by an independent lab. The statistics ignore almost 10,000 other candidates. And there's a really good theory for how the hair got there by accident. In a real forensic investigation, any one of these would be a giant red flag.
The identification of Carl Webb was an amazing story, and it felt like it offered closure to one of history's greatest mysteries. But when you critically review the science, the evidence just doesn't hold up. The identification fails to meet even basic forensic standards. And that means, after all this time and all those headlines, the true identity of the Somerton Man is very likely still a mystery.